Hello again, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all. And thanks for joining us on this sort of cold, wintry night in New York. We are joined by the lovely Ariel Cohen, who's back with us for an encore performance after her fabulous talk in February, who's coming to us from, I think, sunny and warm LA, right, Ari? We're
From Los
officially
Angeles.
envious. So I just want to introduce Ari for anybody who is not familiar with her work. Ari completed her doctoral work in history at the University of Virginia, her MA in art history at Columbia, and her BA in both history and art history at the University of Pennsylvania. She is a published author and a noted lecturer in community centers, academic conferences, university classrooms, and religious spaces. She is also a former curator, a visual culture lover, and a museum educator with an unwavering passion for art and objects. Her background includes curating an exhibition of Norman Lewis's abstract expressionist work at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, educating young children on ancient mosaics at the Getty Villa, and creating scavenger hunts for groups of middle school children visiting the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She is currently working on a book on the history of American Jewish museums. Outside of the classroom, you can find Ari doing yoga, hiking, swimming, or cooking colorful vegetarian dishes. You'll have to come talk to us about that sometime next. And Ari is currently teaching at the Geffen Academy, affiliated with UCLA. And Ari, thank you so much for being here with us again. It's a joy to see you again.
Thank you so much for having me. So last time I was with you guys, I think I spoke about Frieda Schiff-Warburg and Minion Ravenowitz. And I remember some of you being there. I think Barbara, maybe Leslie, maybe Sherry. So it's nice to see you guys again.
And also definitely, sorry to interrupt, definitely Lori, who's I think mother or mother-in-law. Lori, remind us.
Lori, it's great to see you. Of course, I remember. Yeah, Lori's, I want to let you talk about this too, but Lori's mother-in-law worked with Frieda Schiff-Warburg on establishing a YMHA and a preschool, is that right?
My mother-in-law's grandmother started the 92nd Street Y, Bella Unterberg, and her best friend was Frieda Warburg.
Yeah. Really cool residence there. That was so much fun when I was with you guys in February. And I think we had an email correspondence, actually, me and your mother-in-law about it. So cool. Well, it's great to be back with you all, and it feels appropriate to be with you to talk about a topic that's highly relevant to Reform Judaism. So I was looking some things up about Temple Sinai of Roslyn, and I see that it's the largest Reform synagogue on Long Island, which is very cool. So maybe it's no coincidence that I was asked to give this talk to a Reform congregation, because the topic of today's conversation will be the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati and the museum that was established there by what we called the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods. How many of you have heard of Women of Reform Judaism as a movement? I see people raising their hands. Do you want to just raise your hand if you're on the screen, if you've heard of it? Cool. Okay, great. So in 1913, the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods was established as the Reform Women's Arm, so the women's movement of Reform Judaism. And in 1993, it was rebranded as what we call Women of Reform Judaism, and continues to be the largest and loudest voice for Reform Jewish women in our country and actually in the world. The Reform movement is strongest here, so it's no surprise that the biggest Reform women's movement and organization is here, but the roots were really planted in 1913. So why am I talking about that when I'm here to talk about Judaica, right? Let me share my screen and I will explain. So on October 2nd in 1875, the Hebrew Union College opened in Cincinnati. And in Cincinnati, there was a large Reform Jewish community. It was the first rabbinical school to be Reform in the country. And it was established on not here, not in this picture, but actually here. So this is the basement of a building that was, I believe, a conservative synagogue, not a Reform synagogue. This was how HUC was established. And you can see there's just a menorah in the corner, very simple Ner Tamid, very few windows. It's a basement, it's nothing. So back here, this was in 1780 when HUC moved into a much larger, much more majestic building. So again, why are we beginning here? Why are we beginning in 1875 in Cincinnati? So in 1880, HUC moved into a new building in a trendy part of town. The first floor was in very large part a library. And in this rabbinical school, the library was by far the most important feature and where rabbinical students spent most of their time, very much in the European model of rabbinical schools, which prized Talmudic study and basically sitting around and talking about books. That's what Reform Jews were doing in 1880 as well in America, who were training to be rabbis. There were no women training to be rabbis at that time. We know Reform Judaism has been a really important forcing function for women in general to be a bigger part of Jewish cultural and spiritual life in America, but not in 1880, right? So here's some HUC history from a website, from an HUC website actually, which I was very curious about how they're narrating their own history. So in 1875, the first permanent rabbinical seminary in North America is established, as we discussed. And then it skips ahead to 1948. So all of you and I know that Reform Judaism has been extremely important in lifting women's voices and in raising women's voices in America in general, and also raising Jewish women's voices. Jewish women played an outsized role in establishing the right to vote in America for women in 1920. In the 1910s, as early as 1905, Jewish women are rallying, giving speeches, organizing communities around women having the right to vote. We also see that in Reform Judaism and with HUC in particular, ordaining women became a thing, which was a very important thing that happened in 1972. I think that, is the rabbi of your congregation a woman? I believe she is, correct?
We have two. Our senior rabbi is a man and our associate rabbi is a woman.
Great. Yes, I think I remember meeting the associate rabbi. So that's what I'm remembering. So anyway, in 1948, the first cantorial school is founded in North America at HUC in Cincinnati. And then in the 60s, the movement to have a closer connection with Israel was an important kind of characteristic to HUC. So the campus in Jerusalem was created, which some of you might have heard of, the really big kind of majestic campus right by the old city, in the old city walls at HUC. And HUC now has many campuses, including in my hometown of Los Angeles, where I now live. It also has a campus in New York, in downtown, and on the Lower East Side, and there's a campus in Cincinnati still. Then the fourth campus is in Jerusalem. So in 1970, HUC started requiring rabbinical students to study in Israel as part of their academics. And then again in 72, Sally Priesand is ordained the first woman rabbi. In 1975, the first woman cantor is ordained through HUC. And in 1990, the first clinical pastoral program is established in a Jewish seminary, also at HUC. HUC is the leading reform rabbinical school in America and one of the few, and was back then in 1875 when it was established, and continues to be so today. I still haven't answered the question of why am I beginning here for a talk on Judaica. I promise I will. I promise I will very soon. So HUC ordained the first woman rabbi in the state of Israel in 1992, the same year I was born. And in 2006, ordained the first transgender rabbi. In 2009, ordained the first African-American rabbi. So what's missing? Obviously, we can see this big time gap, right, from 1875 to 1948, in which it seems like there's been no innovation. It seems like, okay, we get the 1960s, we get the 1970s, women get the right to vote in 1920, 20, 30 years later after World War II, people are more interested in equity. They want to be ordaining transgender rabbis. They want to be ordaining women. Okay, fine. We have a lot of innovation in the 70s, 80s, right? Not surprising after 1960s counterculture and all the stuff that was happening in the 60s. But what I'm concerned with as a historian, primarily, is that time period between 1900 and 1930 and the innovation that was happening back then. In particular, I go into archives with two questions. One of them is about how are the arts and culture actually much more important to history than we think they are. In other words, we study hard politics, we study law, we study history of political movements, histories of people. I don't see a lot of study of the arts and the arts communities when it comes to religion in America between 1900 and 1930, and the ways in which the arts actually played a really big role in causing broader innovations structurally in communities. So what do I mean? I'll get to that in just a moment. So before the 1960s, HUC purchased its large building on West 6th Street, the trendy area I was referring to, 5 years after HUC was established. The building was dedicated in '81, and the size and quality of the library were truly exceptional. The early books were mostly gifts donated by people, and that is telling and notable because it says a lot about what HUC was and meant. In other words, it was a communal endeavor. It was a communal endeavor very much reliant upon philanthropy. So fast forward to 1905. So there is a librarian. There are several librarians who are in charge of the library from 1881 to 1905. I'm not going to get into them today because we're more concerned with Judaica. But by 1905, a new guy, Adolf Oko, is hired as HUC's librarian, and he takes charge of creating an expansion of the library. Now, by 1881, there was already a big collection, as I mentioned. It's mostly, though, a collection of books, not manuscripts, not rare books. And then by the 90s, by the 1890s, early 1900s, the collection is expanding largely at the hands of couple donors and also female donors. So I see women playing some kind of role as early as 1901, 1902, 1903 in donating these rare books and manuscripts and objects that are bought from Europe and shipped to the United States, bought from Russia, Poland, Ukraine, but also Germany, France, Jewish objects, Judaica. So we start seeing this uptick in interest in Judaica in the early 1900s, again, mostly by women who have these objects in their homes. And there are a couple of reasons for this. I think one is that women were taking charge of the domestic space by the early 1900s and playing their own leadership roles in their own domestic spaces, kind of curating. When immigrants came to America, there was a generation of kind of trying to make it, and then there was a generation of having made it and having resources at their disposal. The German wave of immigration, because it was in the late 1800s, meant that Germans such as Frieda Schiff-Warburg, who I spoke to you guys about last time, had the financial resources to be buying Judaica by the early 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. So the German Jewish community and German Jewish women of what we might call elite society who went to the opera and organized women's groups, those are the women who are buying up Judaica and who are interested in donating it to places like HUC. So starting in 1905, right away when Adolf Oko is hired, I start seeing, well, I wasn't there in 1905, but I was there in the archives in 1905. And that's where I started seeing letters to and from Adolf Oko between him and a bunch of women who said, we have all these objects, they're really rare, we want them displayed somewhere, what about the library? Now, the library is not equipped for the display of objects yet. It's 1905, Adolf Oko is just hired. The library is a library. It's not a museum. There aren't really places to be exhibiting in that space. But Adolf Oko, persuaded by many of the women who he was in conversation with, decided, maybe we can create a couple of display cases. Why not? It seems harmless, right? Let's do it. Sure. And then by 1920, we see this shift in Adolf Oko in which he starts saying things like, we're going to make Cincinnati the cultural Jewish center. And he starts talking about culture, and he starts talking about objects and thinking about how exhibitions and physical things other than books can be really important to Judaism and to spiritual life and cultural life. So this is a quote that I put up here that's from 1930, which was Oko's 25th year at HUC. So back to 1910, I wanted to give a broader picture of HUC and what it looks like so that you can see the first floor was huge. It looks quite like this today. It's a little bit bigger and rounder. There are edges to it now, but really HUC is on the exact same campus as 1910. There's only been expansion. And actually a notable expansion was the Jacob Rader Marcus archives have their own building now. So a lot of the books and rare manuscripts and frankly objects that Jewish women were donating in as early as 1905 live now in the Jacob Rader Marcus archives, which are a totally separate building, just a couple feet to the right of this picture. This is actually a postcard. So HUC in 1910 is already a major cultural center. Reformed Jews all over the country know what it is, and their rabbis are coming from there. So this is a postcard that was sent around the country, and it was sent as part of a fundraising campaign. So this is 1910. Already in 1910, women are organizing to donate money to HUC for scholarships, especially for Russian and Polish immigrants who are coming to New York, mostly to New York City's Lower East Side through Ellis Island. And German women are saying to themselves, how can we fund and support Reform Judaism being a thing? They're coming from Germany, where they were very highly assimilated and highly integrated into German society. Their parents came from Germany. And then these women of the next generation in the 19-teens are saying to themselves, we want to invigorate Reformed Jewish life here in America in some way. How can we do that? Let's organize and let's develop things and help support things that are already in process. So HUC was one of those organizations that was already in process, and women stepped in and said, we want to support this. So by 1913, these women are no longer just couple teams. A lot of women wrote letters on behalf of their husbands or from me and my husband, blah, blah, because it was considered more acceptable to be a philanthropist if you did so in conjunction with your husband. But by 1913, women were saying, actually, we need our own arm now. We need our own organization in Reform Judaism to be supporting HUC and to be also supporting other things. So in their founding charter in 1913, they listed all sorts of important things. One of the most important amongst them is actually that they were founded to advance Jewish religious observance in the home and in the synagogue, but not just to advance it through the use of meaningful ritual objects. So in the founding document, it actually says, and goes into quite distinctive detail, that Jewish reading materials, Jewish physical objects, it lists them, menorahs, Torahs, paintings and drawings that help you pray. They just listed these incredible things in their founding charter. Really unprecedented things, because rabbis were not concerned with building, for example, Jewish day schools yet. They weren't really doing that for people outside of rabbinical schools. So it was kind of unheard of for women to be saying, actually, objects, books, manuscripts, paintings, menorahs, these are in our founding charter as important things to buy up for synagogues. In addition to that, in the founding charter, this has truly stunned me and stunned other historians who work in this area. In the founding charter, they also said, our goal is to establish in every synagogue and every Reform congregation in the country an art museum. And it doesn't sound like a super radical assertion at that time. To us now, it doesn't sound radical, but it was quite radical to think that a space of prayer and spiritual meaning should also have physical objects was just unheard of. It was totally new. So NFTS, the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, was founded with the goal of bringing together Reform congregations across the country under this umbrella mission, which was, let's reinvigorate spiritual life by making objects really central, So this was just, I included for fun because it's in 1922, and this is HUC's faculty and HUC's rabbinical students and cantorial students. So obviously it's all men wearing black and ties. And I'm always just interested by, again, the narration of history, because at this time, women were busy building a museum. but they're obviously not in this picture, right? So all of these people's wives, those who have them, I imagine were very involved in the life of HUC, involved as donors, involved as Rebbitzins leading their own initiatives. As I'm sure a lot of you know, Rebbitzins, which means just wife of rabbi in Yiddish, really played huge roles in their congregations in terms of establishing their own organizations as part of congregations. And this wasn't limited to the post-1950s era. We're talking 1920s, 1930s. Women are establishing libraries, they're establishing museums, they're establishing all sorts of things. So who's not featured here? I do see one woman, actually, a couple of women now that I'm looking more closely, but very, very few. So in 1931, there's a letter from the executive secretary of the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods talking about the Union Museum campaign. So in all the histories about HUC Library and Museum, Adolf Oko is credited for the establishment of the museum. NFTS is barely and rarely credited or discussed, frankly, at all. And sitting in the archives in Cincinnati in the Jacob Rader Marcus room, which was, of course, endowed in large part by women as well and supported by women, I found myself going through these letters and realizing that there was a big untold story here of sisterhoods around the country banding together to establish this museum, not just Adolf Oko. And in fact, actually, he was quite resistant at times to the campaign to establish a museum. He wasn't all that interested in objects. I see parallels here between Adolf Oko and also the librarian at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which some of you might have heard of. It's uptown in New York. At JTS, there was a librarian named Alexander Marx at this same time in the 1920s and 10s and 30s, and he was there for many, many years. And he was not interested in objects. He just didn't really care that much about Judaica. Women approached him all the time and said, I have this object, I have that object, I want a museum at JTS. And he was like, I don't know, I'm not that interested. Adolf Oko was kind of the same. He wasn't super interested, but the executive secretary of the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods beat his doors down until he was interested. She just said, you promised that you'd let us interview you about the holdings of the library for our campaign. Like, where are you? You know, you're not answering my calls. You're not answering my telegraphs. There were all these cool letters about how this executive secretary just felt like, why aren't you prioritizing establishing a museum? Of course it's important. So it's very interesting. So I included some of these letters. I'm just going to go through them quickly. This is one in which she says, can I please come over and talk to you about the Union Museum campaign? So without Adolf Oko's permission, without his idea, the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods said, we want to get involved in the life of Reform Judaism. We want to ensure that it's a voice of meaning and connection for the future, for future Jews in our country. So how can we do that? We want to establish a museum. So they start writing these letters to Adolf Oko, and they start organizing across the country with each other. So here is another letter from 1931 in which a woman is Miss Fanny Stern. So the executive secretary is writing to a Miss Fanny Stern about the Union Museum campaign and can you help us with it, basically. So at this point, in 1931, there's this growing physical collection of Judaica objects at the hands of the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods that doesn't really have a home yet. So they're still just collecting and they're like, Adolf Oko, let's go. Here's another letter from 1931 from the executive secretary. We have asked each sisterhood to appoint a special local chairman for the Union Museum campaign. So now by 1931, they're actually having local chairmen all across the country, including in my native Los Angeles, to organize around supporting the establishment of the Union Museum. In order to acquaint these women with the subject and to give them at least an introduction to the subject so that they may assume the responsibilities which rest with them in the campaigning, we are sending a copy of the enclosed letter as soon as the name of the chairman is received. So the letter has the history of the sisterhood, and basically makes a case for why the Union Museum is a really important endeavor. Here is another article from 1931. This is one of the many articles I found saying, you promised us an interview. When are we getting it? We want to quote you in our stuff. So where are you? So these are, this is Helen Strauss being insistent that she get an interview from Adolf Oko about Jewish objects. The other thing is that by the early 1930s, there are a couple of display cases in the Union Museum. And not only that, by the early 1930s, HUC actually becomes an authority figure on Judaica objects. So people are writing from across the country saying, I have this object in my home. What does it mean? And can you help us decipher what it means? So here's the librarian Adolf Oko answering one of those questions. And let's see, it was very kind of you to send the 2 items for the HUC College Museum. I think that both of them are very unusual. So oftentimes women would send objects to include in exhibitions as not only a way to display their own stuff, but also a way to contextualize it, because lots of women and men had objects in their homes that they didn't really know much about. So there was a woman who had there were many women who had ideas for exhibitions to put on, who wrote to Oko. Unfortunately, in part because of the structure of the archives and in part because of the value system of various archives in our country, those letters by women are not kept. So as a historian, I sit in archives from 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and women's voices are really difficult to trace because the letters of women have either been destroyed or lost, whereas the letters of more traditional leaders like the Adolf Oko, the librarian, or rabbinical students who then went on to have flourishing rabbinical careers, those are the archives that are kept. And the archives that are not kept are Rebbitzins. So the current dean of JTS and one of my mentors, Julie Rubin Schwartz, wrote a book about Rebbitzins and the history of Rebbitzins, in which she really recovers a lot of that lost history of the 1920s and 30s and later. And talks about what were Rebbitzins up to, and in part they were establishing museums. So this is another letter which I'm not going to go over because we're running short on time, and I want to get into, before I finish up, I want to be able to get into the fate of the HUC collection and where it is today. But fast forward, and so this is, I'll just say broad strokes, this is another letter from someone who wants to know more about an object in his possession. So this is the HUC Skirball Museum today. It's actually really extensive. This is from the 2nd floor. And there are lots of exhibits. This is from a Zoom exhibit that they did in quarantine. And always at the center, at the bottom, there's that Torah, and it's a really special World War II saved Torah. So I think that's part of the permanent display, and then everything else is temporary, or the impermanent displays. But everything out here is actually from the permanent collection. So a lot of these objects that were donated in the 30s and 20s by women, by the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, still exist there today. Unfortunately, a lot of that history is lost because I'm sure you all know, whenever you go to a museum, it says gifted by, right? So there's that tagline, gifted by. But when you go up to an object and it says gifted by Felix and Frida Warburg, it doesn't say gifted by the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, or gifted as part of XYZ campaign in X year, or gifted by the women's movement of Reform Judaism. It's going to say gifted by husband-wife duo. So oftentimes it wasn't a husband-wife duo, it was actually a woman as part of the the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods campaigns, which is kind of an interesting backstory. And I wish, as a former aspiring curator, I actually wish that there was a way to have more of a tagline on art objects in museums, because oftentimes the patronage of those objects is some of the most interesting stuff, right? So here's the HUC Skirball Museum today. It's still in Cincinnati, but that's not the end of the story. There's actually a lot more to the story. So this is the outside of the museum. It's really beautiful. The Skirball Museum is on HUC's campus. It outgrew the library, so it's kind of across the street. You can see all the way at the right, that brick that we saw in some of the earliest photos of HUC. So to the right in this picture is HUC as we know it from 1910. And then to the left is this big other building, which is just the Skirball Museum. There is another Skirball Museum in the United States of America, and that one exists in my native Los Angeles, and it's now called Skirball Cultural Center, but it was established as a museum. And there is a connection between the two, so I'll get into that in just a moment. Here's the permanent collection. The quality of this is not great, but it gives you an idea. So fast forward to 1996. By the way, this is current. So this is today, the HUC Skirball Museum in 2021. And the HUC Skirball Museum was established many, many decades ago because it outgrew the library fairly quickly. So it was established a long time ago. But then later in 1996, the Skirball Cultural Center in Los Angeles is established by several figures, including Jack Skirball, who was involved in funding the Independent Museum in Cincinnati as well. The namesake is the same. So if you go to the Skirball Cultural Center website, what you'll find is very interesting. It's fascinating. What you'll find is a web page detailing the history of the Skirball Cultural Center, which basically doesn't tell you any of the history. So it talks about the founder, Yuri Hersher. He is an important character. It talks about how the architecture is inspired by nature. Okay. It talks about the namesake, Jack Skirball. Yes, he's also important. He gave some of the money for the museum, not all, but some. And there's zero mention of Adolf Oko, first of all. There's zero mention of the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, zero mention of HUC in Cincinnati. It's very, very just all about what happened in the 90s, who gave the money, no women involved in the history at all. And in fact, almost the entire early collection from 1996 was the collection from Cincinnati. So there's no mention of the fact that all these objects are shipped in from Cincinnati, from this historic collection of Judaica that existed in Cincinnati for so many years and was such an important part of HUC and was really what changed Reform Judaism at its core to be something that valued objects and valued materiality and valued ritual and valued touching an object as a spiritual act, right? So there's no mention of any of that. No mention of the fact that even still today, the Skirball, much of its collection comes directly from Cincinnati. And nobody would ever know that unless they were in the museum community or the small community of historians that I kind of swim in, like 20 of us. So it's kind of wild how this history is remembered. So that's the Skirball. Today, the collection lives in Cincinnati and lives at the Skirball in Cincinnati and also at the Skirball in Los Angeles. So lest I end this presentation with you thinking that NFTS was the only sisterhood community that was establishing museums at this early time period, I wanted to just remind you of something that I spoke about last time I was with you, which was Minion Ravenowitz. So I know only a few, I think probably about half of you actually were there. I'm just looking at the names here. So Minion Ravenowitz was one of the Rebbitzins who I referred to earlier in my talk when I said a lot of Rebbitzins were super involved and did very cool things. Minion Ravenowitz was one of them. So Minion Ravenowitz was from from Baltimore. And she fell in love with a man who was a rabbinical student at JTS, and they got married. And when they did, he was hired at Mishkan Tefillah in Boston, where people like Leonard Bernstein were members. Leonard Bernstein was a child and a member of the congregation, or he might have been born actually a couple years after Minion, or Minnie, as I like to call her, got there. But in any event, he was a small child while she was there. So she arrived in 1915, and by 1920, she said, wait a second, there's no library. So first things first, I'm establishing a library, and I'm going to do it with the bridge tables that women are using. So the Sisterhood was all about bridge and playing bridge. She got there and she was like, no, bridge is stupid. This is ridiculous. We're doing more important things here. And she revamped all the bridge tables and made them into a library, which is so cool. And the back closet, which was used for storage for bridge stuff, she converted it into a library. And she went around the community and asked for books. And then she started collecting rare books and manuscripts. So much like the collection at HUC, the collection at Mishkan Tefillah in Boston, which was one of the wealthiest congregations in the country. And by the way, it's conservative, not reform. So this is a conservative movement museum, open to whoever though for visiting. She established a library that had a bunch of rare books and manuscripts. And by 1929, she insisted upon the Sisterhood raising money for different display cases. And she started slowly buying up display cases. And then 1940 was the grand opening of what we're looking at right now, which is the actual museum in Mishkan Tefillah. The fate of this museum is something I could give a separate talk on if anybody's interested in African-American Jewish relations, because it actually was fated as a museum of African-American culture and history, and then essentially destroyed. It was a great failed attempt at reparations, at repairing the relationship between Jews and African-Americans after some kind of schisms had occurred in the community in Boston in particular. So this is 1966, this is much later. And 1958 is when this museum moved into a separate space, because the temple moved into a separate space with Jews basically leaving Roxbury, which became predominantly African-American, and moving to Newton, which is a suburb of Boston, which many of you probably have heard of. So Minion Ravenowitz is just one more example of a woman who got together, who really established the sisterhood at Mishkan Tefillah. When she was hired, there was an auxiliary, it was called the Women's Auxiliary, and they funded pews and sidurim and other stuff, but they really weren't funding anything of their own initiative. When Minion Ravenowitz got there, she said, no, we're going to do something on our own initiative. Get rid of the bridge tables, make them a library. Get rid of the bridge closet, make it a library, and then let's make a museum. So this was the Sisterhood Museum. It was actually called that, and it was established by the Sisterhood by 1940. So women were taking their own initiative and establishing museums on their own. And these museums are really fascinating because men were just so uninvolved. Like in the early years, rabbis really were very uninvolved in the establishment of these quote unquote alternative spaces. They were considered to be alternative. So it was like, oh, whatever, we'll just let them do their tiny little thing. Meanwhile, these museums became really big and really important. So by 1942, we actually have visitors coming into Minion Rabenowitz's temple space, the museum, such as Albert and Elsa Einstein. We have Eleanor Roosevelt, who shakes hands with Minion Ravenowitz on a stage, and Eleanor Roosevelt talks about World War II and how important it is that we all know what Jewish objects are and what they're used for. So I have this amazing speech by her, which I found in the archives in 1942 as Roosevelt was passing through Boston, and Minion Ravenowitz apparently had a relationship with her, which is super cool. So here she is in 1964, being honored as head of the museum for so many years. And this was a joint birthday party for her and her husband, but at the event, there were all kinds of speeches made about her and honoring her. These are flowers that she was granted for her role at the museum. And then to the left, you actually see at the back, the Rebbitzin that came after her, who was less interested in objects, but still carried on the tradition. That Rebbitzin then became the next head of the museum, and so on, several Rebbitzins after as well. Today, that collection has largely downsized. Unfortunately, like many other congregations in our country, Mishkan Tefillah has had some financial woes in the past 20 years, so they sold a lot of their art objects. And there's no longer a separated museum space. However, some of the really cool early objects are still on display in the lobby in their own cases. So that's just about all the time we have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can have some time for questions and answers. And I'm so excited to hear what questions you might have.
Oh, Ari, thank you for a fabulous presentation. It's so interesting. I have to say, I'm hugely impressed with Minion Ravenowitz's gumption in forming that museum, and slightly aghast at seeing those prints just laid out on a table without any casework around them and without any, light monitoring devices or whatever. But I know she was working on getting casework for everything, but you see it now and you sort of shudder a little bit. Just absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, one question that we got before I ask some of my own, Leslie had a question about that photo that you showed of HUC early on with, the mass of men. And apparently there were, I guess, 3 women that Leslie counted in the photo. Do you have any idea what their roles would have been at HUC?
So typically at that time, there were the secretaries of the provosts who were women. That I know more about JTS, much more about history of JTS than I do history of HUC, but I can speak from experience at JTS that the only women who were there were secretaries, and they were treated very well, but they were secretaries. So I'd imagine some of them are secretaries. It's very obvious that Revitzins are not included in this photo. So if anything, they're secretaries or otherwise employees. Definitely not rabbinical students, as we obviously know, because it wasn't until 1972 that, or a couple years before 1972, that there started to be, that Sally Presand was a student at
Right,
HUC.
it would have been way too early. A few questions, one of which occurs to me. Do they know sort of the provenance of the objects that the sisterhoods, like first in the sisterhood in Cincinnati, for instance, in forming the Hebrew Union collection? Were these objects that were just in these women's families passed down from generation to generation? Were these women collectors? Were they out actively seeking Judaica objects?
So women in rooms in which art objects were being auctioned was actually still rare at this time, meaning these were not women who were open collectors seeking out the purchasing of objects. That wasn't until probably the 50s, after World War II, that women really were more vocal and served on the Metropolitan Museum of Art's board and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston's board. So that was a bit later. But I would say maybe a third of the objects were in the family. And let's say the other 2/3 were ones that were purchased by a husband-wife duo or a husband who went to an auction and bought something. And many men who were buying such objects were rescuing them from Europe. So there's this troubled object, can you buy it to rescue it? There were people who approached people and said things like that. And then women often were the ones taking initiative, actually donating the objects once they were in their homes. So that's sort of how it worked. But I'd say a good third of them were in the family, like, oh, my grandpa brought this back from the Pale of Settlement, and I want it to be seen and understood, and can you help me understand it? So they would approach scholars at HUC and at JTS and at other rabbinical schools, or Columbia University and Harvard University had Semetics departments. So you had people like Cyrus Adler, who was the first Semetics PhD in our country, graduating in, I think it was 1893, around there. People were approaching people like him and saying, can you help us contextualize these objects? But he was not only a scholar, he was also someone who curated exhibitions all over the place. So there's this kind of interconnected world, if that makes sense.
It does. Cecile.
Could you just define what is included in the term Judaica? Is it only things that have a ritual background, or are the archival things that you have discovered ownered, in the ownership category of Jewish persons?
So the question is, what is Judaica? How do we define it?
Yes, because if we go to a quote unquote Jewish museum, we're seeing artists who were Jewish. We see what I would consider as Judaica as ritualistic objects, but now I'm thinking differently now. So I'm wondering what the actual definition is, as you see it, as Judaica.
My parents, Lori and David, both of whom are on this Zoom, hi mom and dad, taught me that it's very rude to answer a question with a question. But I actually have to answer a question with a question because in the 1960s, there was a big controversy at the Jewish Museum. The Jewish Museum in New York started exhibiting not only Judy Chicago, if anybody's heard of her, she did some big minimalist art exhibitions. I believe it was either 1966 or maybe a couple years prior, but I do think it was 1966. There was an exhibit called Primary Structures at the Jewish Museum, in which basically curators argued that Judaica included minimalist architecture and art, that if it was done by Jews, okay, fine, it's Jewish. Or even if it wasn't, minimalism is sort of a Jewish-led movement, so why not have that be Judaica? So that question of what is Judaica was kind of splashed into the world in 1966 with this Primary Structures exhibition. And ever since then, I think Jewish museums are still trying to find their footing and figure out what is Jewish art, what's not, what is Judaica and what's not. In the scholarly community, in anthropology and history and art history, Judaica is defined as ritual objects, so objects that are actually used in Jewish ritual. However, in the community of curators and people who are putting on exhibitions, there's a question there. What is Judaica? I have a mentor named Vanessa Oakes, who's terrific, and she writes that she wrote an article called What Makes a Jewish Home Jewish? It's a very good article. And in part of it, she writes that a wall completely packed to the brim with books is Jewish. Don't care if it's a Jewish home or not, that's Jewish. It's a Jewish thing. Can that be Judaica? That's the question. I don't know. It's a question she's asking. But really in the scholarly community, Judaica is just pure and simple ritual objects used ritually in Judaism. So menorah, Torah, mezuzah, paintings are not included in what is considered to be Judaica by that standard definition. Ask a curator at the Jewish Museum and you'll get a different answer.
I guess paintings would fall into the fine art category.
Right, exactly. Mm-hmm.
That's a great question though, Cecile. And anybody, please feel free to unmute and ask questions or type questions into the chat. And while you're thinking of additional questions, I have one or two, if you'll humor me, Ari. So separate and apart from the sisterhoods that helped found these kind of essential collections, were women playing other roles in the foundation of museums?
So the question is, separate from the foundation of the museums that we discussed today, were women playing key roles?
Right. I know you spoke about this a bit to us in February.
Yeah. So at the Jewish Theological Seminary, so I mentioned secretaries in passing, that if there was a photo of HUC that included women, it's probably including secretaries. So there was a woman named Hannah Klebansky, or Anna Kleban, as she retitled herself when she immigrated through Ellis Island. She was from Grodno, the contested borderlands between Poland and Russia. And she, after two of the pogroms, she came to the United States and she got a job at JTS where her uncle was a professor. She got a job as the secretary to the librarian of JTS, who I mentioned in passing earlier in this talk. His name was Alexander Marx. And as secretary, she first and foremost learned English. She also dealt with the books and rare manuscripts of the library. And then as soon as she could, around 1933, 1934, she started a museum. So she was called secretary until 1956 when she was retitled field coordinator, because she started coordinating field trips and trips of women, sisterhoods, and trips of also rabbinical students from around the country, including from places like HUC, where guys would come, rabbis in training would come from Cincinnati to visit the museum at JTS, and Anna Kleban would tour them around and say, here are all the objects. She was also the intermediary between female donors such as Frieda Schiff Warburg, the founder of the Jewish Museum in New York, and other important, mostly German, but also some Polish and Russian donors, who communicated with her about objects they wanted to give. She was the intermediary. So as secretary and then field coordinator, she basically, my argument in my book, which is not out and won't be for years, but because it takes a long time. But in my dissertation, my argument is that she actually was a curator, and that was what her role was. And from letters, correspondences, oral histories, we know that her day-to-day job was curating objects. So there are many women like that. Jessica Feingold also played a role at JTS. She was the secretary of Louis Finkelstein, the chancellor at JTS. There are all kinds of women who show up in that way as leaders in the arts-based community, because you have all these men who are establishing these alternative spaces of Jewish life, right? So you have like the YMCA, you have the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, you have the Jewish Agency, you have all these organizations that are being founded. And then you also have women questioning, well, what is our place? What can we do that's innovative and different and interesting? And the answer came in the form of establishing museums and working with art, which was largely uncharted territory.
Thanks, Ari. And apropos this line of conversation, when do you think women really started taking active leadership roles in museums, you know, in more contemporary times?
So from the 1970s, so Primary Structures was in 1966 at the Jewish Museum. Since then, the vast majority of heads of the Jewish Museum have actually been women. And I believe it's since 1975 that every single one has been a woman. I need to check my facts on that because it might be 1980, but somewhere between 1975 and 1980, every head of the Jewish Museum has been a woman. So all of a sudden, after the 1960s and 70s, you have women not only as kind of closet patrons and donors, but also women as heads of museums and heads of things. But these few women, like the Minion Rabenowitzes of the world, charted the path for later women.
Amazing, amazing. I don't know if anybody else has other questions, but if not, we are going to thank you tremendously for another wonderful presentation, Ari. And this is just part 1 of 2. So we hope you're all going to join us 2 weeks from tonight on Tuesday, December 14th for part 2 of Ari's amazing talk on Judaica in America. And Ari, thank you as always for being with us, even if it's long distance. We feel like you're right here with us on Long Island. And we're just always so grateful for your poise and your wisdom and, you know, your insights into this very, very interesting field of women in the Jewish arts. And join us again in 2 weeks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. Quick shout out to Adrienne, who also has a vast and incredibly impressive background in curation and in the art world at the Museum of the Bible in New York City and other places, and who also was kind of a guiding light for me many moons ago when we discussed jobs in the art world. So thank you so much for having me, Adrienne, and thank you for being such a wonderful audience and community. I look forward to seeing you guys in 2 weeks.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Happy
Happy Hanukkah. Thank you.